So, in the town of Abdanon, there was this incident where angry protesters stormed a supermarket,
Right.
but they didn't actually steal the food. They grabbed this wildly expensive bag of rice, like something that costs the equivalent of a month's minimum wage.
Yeah, and they just tore it open.
Exactly. Just tore it open and scattered the grains all over the street.
It's just such a striking, visceral image,
Yeah.
you know? I mean, it wasn't theft. It was this furious, symbolic rejection of a whole system.
A system that turns basic, necessary food into a luxury item.
Right, exactly.
Hmm.
All while the people at the top are getting just incredibly rich off the scarcity.
So today on this deep dive, we want to welcome you as we look past the barrage of military strikes and the nuclear talks of early 2026.
Right.
We really want to answer one specific question for you.
Yeah, the big question.
How did a nation sitting on, 24% of the Middle East's oil reserves make a simple bag of rice unaffordable for its own people?
It is wild when you put it like that.
It is. We are diving into the actual engine running Iran behind the scenes, its political economy.
Because to really grasp what is driving the headlines today, you have to understand the foundational structure of that economy.
You can't just look at the surface.
No, you really cannot analyze the military maneuvers or the diplomatic negotiations without, following the money.
Right.
And the core concept at play here from our sources is what economists call a rentier state.
Okay, let's unpack this, because a rentier state, it's kind of like a trust fund kid, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Like, this kid doesn't necessarily need to get a job or develop marketable skills or even listen to anyone's advice, because they just live off this massive unearned inherited wealth.
Exactly. And in the case of a nation state like Iran, the government historically hasn't really needed to rely heavily on taxing the productivity of its citizens.
Because they have the oil.
Right. They survive on massive external oil rents paid by foreign buyers. And when a state gets the vast majority of its income from selling a natural resource to the outside world,
It changes everything.
it fundamentally alters the relationship between the government and the governed.
Because, we are all familiar with the old rally cry, right?
We-
No taxation without representation.
Yeah, but in a rentier state, the reverse is incredibly powerful. No representation without taxation.
Wait, so basically, if the state doesn't need your tax money to survive...
It fundamentally does not need your consent to govern.
Wow. That's dark.
That is the crux of the issue, really. The traditional link between taxation, democratic accountability, and the rule of law. It's completely severed.
So the government's primary survival goal shifts.
Yes. Instead of fostering a productive, educated working class, they just need to control the oil resource and distribute the profits, the rents, to maintain a network of loyal elites.
And the public just becomes an afterthought.
Pretty much, yeah.
But, looking back at the 1979 revolution, that was absolutely not the original pitch, right?
Not at all.
Like the intellectual architects of that revolution, thinkers like Ali Shariati and Ayatollah Mahmoud Taleghani, they envisioned this decentralized, highly equitable Islamic society.
Right. They explicitly promised to dismantle the massive concentration of wealth from the Shah's regime.
And replace it with, local democratic councils and collective stewardship of the resources.
Yeah, and the gap between those revolutionary ideals and the reality of the ensuing decades is just one of the great historical pivots of the 20th century.
So what happened?
Well, the necessity of post-revolutionary survival, compounded by a brutal, devastating 8-year war with Iraq, and immediate international isolation.
It led to a vastly different outcome.
Exactly. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini centralized power under the doctrine of Walaya-e-Faqih.
Which means guardianship of the Islamic jurist, right?
Yes. Power became hyper-concentrated at the absolute top of the clerical hierarchy.
So instead of a decentralized socialist utopia, our sources say Iran developed a system that operates as a quantitatively socialist model.
Which is a very specific term.
Yeah, they utilize the mechanics of socialism, right? Like imposing massive state monopolies, central planning, taking over major industries.
But they entirely strip out the actual ideology of empowering the working class.
Right. The state sees control of the economy, but that monopoly exists strictly to maintain the political grip of the elites, not to serve the public good.
And monopolizing an entire national economy creates a massive administrative problem.
I bet.
The new government couldn't simply hold all the confiscated wealth of the exiled Shah on a single ledger forever.
They needed a way to distribute it.
Exactly. They needed a complex distribution network to buy loyalty, manage those vast assets, and reward their political base.
And that urgent need birthed one of the most unique financial structures in the world, the boneyards.
Yes, the boneyards.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the boneyards are essentially massive charitable foundations, right?
On paper, at least.
And the original purpose was noble enough, like to redistribute the Shah's confiscated properties to the poor and support veterans from the Iran-Iraq War.
But over the decades, these charities quietly morphed into tax-exempt mega conglomerates operating entirely in the shadows.
And the scale is just mind-blowing. Our sources estimate the boneyards control about 30 to 40% of Iran's entire gross domestic product.
It's staggering.
Just one of them, the Bonyadi Mustazafin, which ironically means the foundation of the disinherited, is valued at upwards of $12 billion.
$12 billion. And they employ around 400,000 people.
And they operate in almost total secrecy, right? Like no independent audits.
None. They answer only to the supreme leader.
And because they operate as charities on paper, they're entirely tax exempt.
Plus, they secure privileged access to unlimited credit from state banks, and they get highly favorable foreign exchange rates from the central bank.
So if you're a regular entrepreneur, how do you even compete?
You don't. You cannot possibly compete with a $12 billion conglomerate that pays no taxes and has a direct line to the supreme leader.
It just completely crowds out normal private business.
It creates an impenetrable parallel economy. But the Bonyads don't operate in a vacuum.
Right, they work with the military.
Specifically, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or the IRGC.
And their involvement in the civilian economy started out of necessity, right? After the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988.
Exactly. The country's infrastructure was in ruins, and the IRGC had this massive pool of mobilized manpower and engineering experience.
So the government just invited them into the civilian economy to rebuild.
Yeah, they formed an engineering conglomerate called Khatam al-Anbiya.
And they aggressively pivoted from fighting a war to dominating civil engineering, like massive no-bid government contracts.
We're talking about projects like a $1.3 billion natural gas pipeline.
Wow.
And a $2.5 billion contract for infrastructure in the South Pars oil field.
And from there, they just expanded into telecommunications, banking, healthcare, everything.
Yes. And what's fascinating here is how the sheer scale of their economic capture became glaringly apparent in the mid-2000s under President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
Right, because he actually ran on a populist platform promising to break up state monopolies and privatize government assets.
Yeah, the Justice Shares program. The government acknowledged the public's frustration and claimed it was going to give well back to everyday people.
But the language of economic reform was, like, expertly weaponized to achieve the exact opposite outcome.
It was classic pseudo-privatization.
The state did sell off major assets, but they didn't sell them to independent private entrepreneurs.
No, they floated them on the stock exchange. And the only entities with the massive capital reserves to buy them were the Bonyads and the IRGC cooperatives.
So they just moved the assets from the formal government's transparent ledger into the opaque shadows.
Exactly. Sociologists refer to this architecture as the subcontractor state.
It's almost like a powerful mafia boss franchising out territory to his capos.
The central government decentralizes the daily economic burden, but it keeps all the actual power firmly within a trusted network of clerics and military commanders.
And the IRGC became the state's ultimate economic subcontractor.
Exactly.
Okay, so this elaborate patronage network functions incredibly smoothly when millions of barrels of oil are flowing out every day.
Right, pouring billions of dollars of hard currency back into the central budget.
But for over a decade, intense international sanctions have actively tried to choke off that exact revenue stream.
And the conventional wisdom globally is that sanctions should naturally crush this kind of rentier system.
The logic makes sense. Cut off the oil money, starve the patronage network, and force the government to change its behavior.
And you certainly see the macro-level squeeze on the country. I mean, Western brands completely vanished, leaving Iranians to consume local knockoffs like Zamzam Cola instead of Coca-Cola.
Right. But hold on, the core assumption is that a shrinking economic pie inherently weakens the ruling elite's grip on power.
Right. But that misses a crucial, perverse dynamic of the Iranian system.
How so?
Counterintuitively, the sanctions have actually enriched the insiders.
Wait, I need you to explain that for the listener, because if sanctions are actively destroying the broader economy, how does making the country poorer make the leaders richer?
Because sanctions do not eliminate the demand for trade. They merely force it into the dark.
Ah.
When formal banking channels like the SWIFT network are blocked, the economy doesn't just power down. It mutates into a trustee economy.
Because trade gets routed through highly opaque, informal networks.
Exactly. This is where you see the emergence of the dark fleet. Hundreds of aging oil tankers disabling their satellite tracking beacons to smuggle crude oil.
And they rely on massive shadow banking networks operating through shell companies in places like the UAE, Hong Kong, Malaysia.
And because formal banking is cut off, a total monopoly is handed to the entities that already control the physical borders and the security apparatus.
The IRGC and the boneyards.
Right. They become the ultimate toll collectors for this dark economy. They charge massive premiums for moving money across borders.
So sanctions effectively created a captive market for corruption. Extreme scarcity generates incredible profit if you control the bottleneck.
Precisely. The Debs Tea Company scandal perfectly illustrates this arbitrage.
Oh, this was crazy to read about.
Yeah, between 2019 and 2022, this nominally private company was granted $3 billion in preferential, highly subsidized foreign exchange by the government.
And that money was supposed to be used to import essential goods, primarily tea, to keep prices low for consumers.
But instead of actually buying the tea, the company executives took those cheap subsidized dollars and sold them on the open black market at a massive markup.
So they just pocketed the astronomical difference. It's pure currency arbitrage.
The state subsidizes an import for the public good, and the insiders siphon the capital directly into their offshore accounts.
And the economic damage goes way beyond just stolen dollars, right? It destroys the foundational value of the currency itself.
Yes. Look at the collapse of Bank Ayanda.
Right. This politically connected bank that managed to accumulate a deficit of nearly 1 quadrillion tomans.
1 quadrillion, just funding its own corrupt shadow operations and real estate ventures.
And the central bank couldn't just let it fail without triggering a systemic collapse, so they had to step in.
And how do they cover a 1 quadrillion toman hole when they're cut off from global finance?
They just fire up the printing presses.
Exactly. They expand the monetary supply without any underlying economic growth to back it up.
And when you flood the market with newly printed currency, the value of the currency already sitting in the pockets of everyday citizens just plummets.
This is why inflation is fundamentally a hidden regressive tax on the poor.
Right. Our sources noted that this single bank's private deficit forced actions that drove 7% of the entire nation's inflation by itself.
One bank made every single family in the country 7% poorer just to cover its own malfeasance.
Which brings us right back to the underlying rage of the people in Abdonan tearing open that bag of rice in the street.
The system is functioning exactly as designed for the people at the top, while the bottom falls out for everyone else.
And this massive disconnect sets the stage for the economic breaking point we are witnessing in early 2026.
The math of the rentier state has finally caught up with the regime.
Yeah, looking at the draft budget for the 2025-2026 fiscal year, it's a glaring admission that the government can no longer afford its traditional model of buying compliance.
They are actively ending the subsidized dollar rates for basic food and medicine.
And the burden of funding the state is aggressively shifting onto the public. Like, for the first time in the history of the Islamic Republic, projected tax revenues are 5.5 times higher than projected oil revenues.
That is a monumental structural shift for a country that has relied on oil for a century.
And the burden of those new taxes falls squarely on the shoulders of struggling small businesses and impoverished citizens.
Because the massive boneyards and the sprawling IRGC conglomerates remain entirely legally tax exempt.
So the state is violently squeezing the working class to make up the immense budgetary shortfall.
And while the citizens are squeezed dry, the remaining trickle of oil wealth is being funneled directly to the security apparatus.
Yeah, in that same budget, 33% of the anticipated oil revenues are allocated directly to the military.
Furthermore, the budget literally grants the military the unprecedented authority to independently sell 230 million barrels of crude oil a year.
Wait, they completely bypass the central bank and the finance ministry?
They simply sell the oil themselves, keep the revenue in their own shadow accounts, and fund their own operations.
The military has evolved into an entirely independent, self-funded economic entity operating inside the shell of the state.
Yes, and this profound internal economic fragility is now colliding violently with the current geopolitical reality.
Right. And just to be completely clear for you listening, we're not taking any political sides here. We're just impartially reporting what the source material lays out about the events of early 2026.
Exactly. And looking strictly at those events, the failure of nuclear talks in February, The subsequent U.S. and Israeli military strikes, the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and the fragile Pakistan-mediated ceasefire in April.
Our focus today isn't on the politics of who is right or wrong in that conflict.
Right. Our focus is purely on the catastrophic economic shockwaves these events triggered inside Iran's borders.
Because the military conflict exposed an existential vulnerability for the Iranian economy, centering on one specific geographic choke point.
Karg Island.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Karg Island is the physical bottleneck for the formal state's survival.
Between 85 and 90% of all of Iran's crude oil exports pass through this single, highly vulnerable island terminal in the Persian Gulf.
A major disruption or the complete destruction of that facility isn't just an economic hit. It is a complete fiscal rupture for the nation.
So if Karg Island goes offline permanently, the formal state budget basically dies overnight.
The central government loses its primary mechanism for generating the hard currency needed to stabilize the rial, pay its millions of civil servants, and maintain basic municipal services.
But, and this is crucial, the IRGC would likely survive that collapse.
Because they already control the vast shadow economy.
So if the formal oil infrastructure is destroyed, the state doesn't evaporate.
No.
It just decentralizes.
The IRGC would fully take over the survival mechanisms of the country.
They would lean entirely into cross-border smuggling with Iraq and Afghanistan, organized bartering systems, trading in gold and rare earth minerals instead of digitally tracked currency.
The centralized rentier state that has defined Iran for decades would essentially collapse.
And it would be replaced by a localized, network-based economy of absolute scarcity, managed by IRGC commanders acting as heavily armed regional warlords.
It's a terrifying prospect.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today for you. We've traced how Iran's oil wealth created a rentier state that severed its democratic accountability.
We explored how revolutionary ideals were subverted to funnel that vast wealth into the tax-exempt bonyads and the military, creating that subcontractor state.
We broke down the mechanics of how international sanctions inadvertently enriched those exact elites by forcing the economy into the shadows where they hold a total monopoly.
And now we see a 2026 crisis where the formal budget is failing, crushing taxes are levied on the poor, and the military is absorbing whatever revenue is left.
So what does this all mean? Every headline you read about Iran moving forward, every nuclear negotiation, every military maneuver, every internal protest, it all must be viewed through this specific economic lens.
Every single action is intrinsically tied to the regime's desperate existential need to maintain its patronage networks and secure its shadow revenue streams.
It is all part of the exact same engine.
It is, which leaves us with a final, vital question to consider.
Yeah.
For decades, the outside world has relied on economic sanctions, and more recently targeted military strikes, to pressure Iran's formal economy, hoping to force a change in the regime's behavior.
Right.
But if the events of 2026 ultimately destroy Iran's formal oil infrastructure entirely, if Karg Island goes offline and the formal budget evaporates, it might inadvertently remove the very last remaining levers the international community has.
Because you cannot sanction a shadow.
Exactly.
If the entire country is forced to become a localized underground economy run entirely off the books by the IRGC, relying on barter and gold smuggling rather than global banks, have we actually made the regime weaker?
Or have we just made it entirely impossible to monitor, influence, or contain?
It is the ultimate paradox of the maximum pressure strategy.
By destroying the formal structures we can see, we may fully empower the shadow structures we can't.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking beneath the surface of the headlines, and remember that in geopolitics, the real story is almost always hiding in the shadows. We will see you next time.